The Ashford family reunion had always been Victoria's personal gauntlet. Yet this year, standing in the marble foyer with Daniel's mother, Eleanor's handprint still burning on her cheek and the word beggar echoing off crystal chandeliers, she felt the 7 years of carefully maintained composure begin to crack like ice under impossible pressure. 20 minutes earlier, she'd been a pregnant woman abandoned in the rain by her billionaire husband, Daniel Ashford, who'd chosen his mistress, Gabrielle Morrison, over the family he'd sworn to cherish, driving away in a car she'd watched disappear while thunder provided percussion to her unraveling life. 90 days before that moment, Victoria had sat in a boardroom under her secret identity as V. Sterling, reviewing Daniel's desperate loan application to Pinnacle Trust, the bank she'd built from her grandfather's hidden inheritance, and she'd approved it despite knowing about Gabrielle, despite suspecting Daniel would leave because she'd been testing a theory about human nature that was about to be proven with devastating accuracy. The slap from Eleanor came during introductions, when Victoria arrived at the reunion without Daniel but with her pregnancy visible, and Eleanor had demanded to know what kind of woman shows up alone to embarrass the family, escalating to physical violence when Victoria quietly explained that Daniel had left her for another woman. Because in Eleanor's world, being abandoned meant you deserved abandonment. Being discarded meant you were disposable. The flashback Victoria couldn't suppress transported her to 7 years ago. Daniel's proposal in Paris, his confession that his business ventures were struggling, yet his confidence that her family's Ashford name would attract investors, his relief when she'd agreed to marry him without demanding a postnuptial agreement, because she'd loved him with the kind of innocence that doesn't survive. Betrayal. What Daniel never learned was that Victoria had spent their entire marriage anonymously funding his ventures through shell companies, propping up his ego while building her own empire in shadows, hoping he'd eventually value her for who she was rather than the name she carried. Yet each rescued business venture only inflated his arrogance, while her invisible support convinced him he was self-made. Now, with Eleanor's slap still stinging and 30 family members watching with expressions ranging from schadenfreude to pity, Victoria faced the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for since purchasing Pinnacle Trust, the decision to either maintain her disguise or unleash the full truth of her identity in a way that would shatter not just Daniel but every Ashford who'd treated her like a charity case they'd graciously accepted. Through the reunion's main doorway, she could see Daniel arriving with Gabrielle on his arm, his face registering shock at finding Victoria present, yet what he couldn't see was the folder Victoria held behind her back. Loan documents from Pinnacle Trust, signed by V. Sterling, with conditions Daniel had agreed to without reading the fine print, conditions that gave the bank controlling interest in his last remaining asset if he violated the morality clause he'd never noticed. Would the woman they'd called a beggar reveal herself as the secret trillionaire who controlled Daniel's financial lifeline, and would the revenge she'd architected with surgical precision destroy him completely or transform him into someone capable of genuine remorse? Could a pregnant wife abandoned in the rain find justice without becoming the very thing she despised? And what happens when a family built on status and appearances discovers that the person they'd dismissed as worthless holds the power to dismantle their entire social structure? Dear viewers, this story reveals how silent strength can become your greatest weapon when others underestimate you. You'll discover why patience and strategy always triumph over impulsive revenge, and how maintaining dignity under attack builds unshakable power. Watch as Victoria teaches us that true transformation requires forcing others to confront their own cruelty, not through destruction, but through revealed truth. Drop in the comments. What lessons did you take from this story? If you were Victoria, what would you have done differently? Subscribe now for more captivating stories that entertain, inspire, and teach. Powerful life lessons you can apply today. The crystal chandelier above Victoria's head refracted light into 1,000 fractured rainbows, each shard of illumination highlighting the shocked faces surrounding her in Eleanor Ashford's marble foyer. Yet none of those faces showed the outrage Victoria had hoped to see, just curiosity, entertainment, the sick fascination people feel when watching someone else's humiliation unfold like performance art they hadn't paid to witness. Eleanor's hand had connected with Victoria's cheek 7 seconds ago, the impact sharp enough to turn heads from the champagne fountain 20 feet away. Yet what lingered wasn't the physical pain, but the word Eleanor had spat immediately after. Beggar. Victoria's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her 7-month pregnancy pressed against the emerald dress she'd chosen specifically because Daniel had once told her green made her look trying too hard, and she felt her daughter kick as if responding to the violence her grandmother had just demonstrated. The baby didn't know yet that her father had abandoned them both 3 weeks ago in a rainstorm that had soaked through Victoria's coat, while Daniel loaded suitcases into his Bentley with hands that had once promised to hold Victoria through every storm life delivered. "Did you hear me?" Eleanor's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade designed for precision wounds. "I called you a beggar, Victoria, because that's what you are now. A woman abandoned by her husband, showing up at a family function to beg for scraps of sympathy. Did you think we wouldn't hear about Daniel leaving you? Did you imagine we'd pretend everything was fine?" Victoria's fingers tightened on the folder she held behind her back, the manila edge pressing into her palm hard enough to leave marks, yet not hard enough to distract from the choice crystallizing in her mind, with the clarity that comes from reaching a point where dignity and destruction stand equally available. She could speak now, reveal everything, unleash the truth that would shatter this family's understanding of power and worth. Or she could wait, let the humiliation compound, ensure that when revelation came it would carry the full weight of their cruelty, amplified by their continued assault. Through the main doorway, Daniel appeared with Gabrielle Morrison attached to his arm, like expensive jewelry chosen to broadcast status rather than celebrate connection. Gabrielle wore red, a dress that screamed for attention in a way Victoria's green whispered for approval, and her hand rested possessively on Daniel's chest as they paused in the entrance, their arrival timed for maximum impact, like actors who'd rehearsed their entrance into a play Victoria hadn't realized she was starring in. Daniel's face cycled through emotions faster than Victoria could catalog them: shock at finding her present, irritation that she'd defied the implicit, command to disappear, calculation about how to manage this situation, and finally, most interesting, a flicker of something that might have been shame, except Daniel had never demonstrated capacity for genuine remorse. His eyes met Victoria's across 30 feet of marble floor and assembled relatives, and Victoria saw him register the red mark on her cheek, saw comprehension begin to dawn that his mother had struck his pregnant wife, yet his arm remained firmly around Gabrielle's waist. "Victoria, darling." Daniel's voice carried across the foyer with the false warmth of a man performing concern rather than feeling it. "I didn't expect you to attend, given the circumstances." "The circumstances of you abandoning your pregnant wife?" Victoria's voice emerged steadier than she'd anticipated, each word measured and precise, carrying to every corner of the room despite her refusal to raise volume. "Or the circumstances of your mother striking me and calling me a beggar in front of your entire family." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet in the adjacent ballroom seemed to pause, as if the musicians sensed that something beyond their scheduled performance was unfolding. Victoria watched Daniel's calculated expression fracture slightly, watched Gabrielle's possessive grip tighten, watched Eleanor's face shift from righteous anger to uncertainty, as she perhaps began to understand that Victoria wasn't responding with the tears or pleading Eleanor had expected. I approved your loan application." Victoria spoke directly to Daniel, her voice conversational despite the 30 witnesses and the moment's wait. "3 weeks ago, Pinnacle Trust, the $50 million line of credit you desperately needed after your last venture collapsed. I was the one who reviewed your application, assessed your assets, evaluated your character, and decided you deserved one final chance." Daniel's face went white, actually drained of color like a person watching their execution approach with mechanical inevitability, because Victoria had just revealed knowledge she shouldn't possess. Loan applications were confidential. Bank decisions were anonymous. The only person who could know those details was someone working at Pinnacle Trust. Yet Daniel thought he knew, that Victoria had been unemployed for 7 years, playing housewife while he built his empire. "That's impossible." Daniel's voice cracked on the second word. "You don't work at Pinnacle Trust. You don't work anywhere." Victoria pulled the folder from behind her back and held it up. The Pinnacle Trust logo visible on the cover, the signature line on the first page showing clearly even from across the room. V. Sterling, president and sole owner. "You're right," Victoria said softly, each word a detonation disguised as conversation. "I don't work at Pinnacle Trust. I own it." The folder hit the marble floor with a sound that shouldn't have been audible over 30 people's simultaneous intake of breath. Yet Victoria heard it clearly, heard the pages scatter slightly, heard the loan documents with Daniel's signature slide across polished stone toward his Italian leather shoes, heard the physical manifestation of 7 years of secrets, finally demanding acknowledgement. Eleanor's hand, which had been raised as if preparing to strike again, froze mid-air like a statue commemorating violence, interrupted. Yet what stopped her wasn't conscience, but confusion, the mathematics of Victoria's claim refusing to reconcile with the reality Eleanor had constructed, where her daughter-in-law represented charity rather than power. "That's absurd." Gabrielle's voice cut through the silence with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet understood that confidence without information is just noise masquerading as authority. "Daniel told me you came from money that disappeared, that your family lost everything before you married him, that he rescued you from what?" Victoria's question sliced through Gabrielle's sentence with surgical precision, each word sharp enough to draw blood without requiring volume. "From poverty, from irrelevance, from the desperate need to attach myself to a man whose business ventures fail so consistently that he's declared bankruptcy twice in 7 years." The number surprised even Daniel. Victoria saw it register on his face, saw him realize she'd been tracking his failures with the kind of detailed attention he'd assumed she was incapable of. Yet what he still didn't understand was that Victoria hadn't just been tracking his failures but funding his recoveries, propping up his ego with anonymous investments while building her own empire in the shadows his arrogance created. Victoria's hand returned to her belly, feeling her daughter kick again, stronger this time, as if the baby sensed her mother's transformation from performed weakness to revealed strength. And the movement grounded Victoria in the present moment, even as memories threatened to pull her into the past. She'd been 23 when her grandfather had called her to his hospital bed, his voice weakened by the cancer that would kill him within days, yet his mind sharp enough to recognize that Victoria possessed something her parents and siblings lacked, the capacity to build rather than merely inherit. "Your grandmother's maiden name was Sterling," he'd whispered, his papery hand gripping Victoria's with surprising strength. "I established a trust under that name 30 years ago, before your father could squander it like he squandered everything else. It's yours now, $12 million in carefully selected assets. But Victoria, listen to me carefully. Never let anyone know your true worth until you're certain they value you beyond your money." She'd honored his warning throughout her relationship with Daniel, watching him fall in love with the Ashford name, while never suspecting that the name came with nothing but debts her parents had accumulated through decades of living beyond their means. The irony had been almost beautiful. Daniel pursuing her for wealth that didn't exist, while dismissing her actual capabilities, the ones that had transformed her grandfather's $12 million into something far more substantial. Pinnacle Trust's acquisition closed 6 months ago, Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt in her core, despite the 7 years of performed submission that had trained her body to shrink even as her mind expanded. The purchase price was $800 million, half in cash, half in assumed assets. The seller wanted to retire. I wanted a platform. The numbers hung in the air like accusations, each digit representing hours Victoria had spent analyzing markets while Daniel slept beside her, nights she'd taken calls from Hong Kong investors while he was out with Gabrielle, mornings she'd reviewed acquisition proposals while preparing breakfast Daniel never thanked her for making. Eleanor's face had progressed from confusion to something approaching horror, yet what horrified her wasn't the revelation of Victoria's wealth, but the dawning understanding of her own cruelty's target. The loan I approved for you, Daniel, came with conditions. Victoria bent slowly, her pregnancy making the movement awkward yet determined, and retrieved a page from the scattered documents, holding it up so the assembled crowd could see the highlighted section even if they couldn't read the specific text. Section 14, subsection C, the morality clause. It states that if the borrower engages in conduct detrimental to family obligations, specifically including but not limited to abandonment of spouse or children, the lending institution assumes controlling interest in all collateral assets. Daniel's hand finally released Gabrielle's waist, dropping to his side with the weight of comprehension that arrives too late to prevent catastrophe, yet early enough to ensure full awareness of its approach. His last remaining asset, the commercial property portfolio his father had left him, the only thing that survived his multiple business failures, had been collateral on the Pinnacle Trust loan, and Victoria watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. Abandoning his pregnant wife in a rainstorm 3 weeks ago had triggered the clause he'd never read, which meant Victoria now controlled the final piece of his financial foundation. You planned this, Daniel's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, yet it carried accusation sharp enough to cut through the crowd's murmuring. You knew I'd leave. You approved the loan knowing I'd violate the clause. You engineered my destruction. No. Victoria's response came immediately, forcefully, with enough conviction to make several witnesses step backward as if creating physical space for the truth she was about to deliver. I engineered your choice. I gave you $50 million and a clear contract that required only basic decency. Remain faithful to your family, honor your obligations, demonstrate minimum character. You could have chosen to be the man you promised to be when we married. You could have read the contract carefully. You could have valued our marriage more than your mistress. Every step of your destruction, Daniel, you walked yourself. The distinction mattered. Victoria needed him to understand that she hadn't forced his betrayal, but merely created consequences for choices he'd made freely. Yet even as she spoke the words, she wondered whether the line between revealing someone's character and manipulating them into revealing it was as clear as she wanted to believe. Her grandfather's trust had been a test of Daniel's character, yet she'd known, hadn't she, what the test would reveal. She'd known 18 months ago when she first discovered the affair, known and chosen to wait rather than confront, chosen to build power rather than demand accountability. Victoria, please. Eleanor's voice had lost its earlier venom, replaced by something that might have been panic, except Eleanor Ashford didn't panic. She recalculated. Let's discuss this privately. Family matters shouldn't be. Family matters. Victoria's laugh emerged sharp enough to surprise herself, sharp enough to cut through Eleanor's sentence. with the efficiency of 7 years of suppressed responses finally demanding voice. Is that what you call striking your pregnant daughter-in-law and calling her a beggar in front of 30 witnesses? Family Matters. The red mark on Victoria's cheek had begun to fade, yet the memory of Eleanor's hand, connecting with her face, remained vivid, remained fuel for everything Victoria had been building toward since the moment Daniel's car disappeared into the rain. She'd spent that night, the first night alone in the penthouse she'd called home for 7 years, reviewing every document, every contract, every piece of the machinery she'd built, ensuring that when revelation came, it would be complete. Now, standing in Eleanor's marble foyer with her secret identity exposed, and her husband's face registering the full weight of his losses, Victoria faced the question she'd been avoiding since purchasing Pinnacle Trust. Did she want Daniel destroyed, or did she want him transformed? Did justice require his complete annihilation, or did it demand something harder, forcing him to rebuild himself into someone capable of understanding what he'd lost? The memory of rain invaded Victoria's consciousness with sensory detail that made the present moment blur. 3 weeks ago, standing outside their penthouse, while water soaked through her coat and Daniel loaded the last suitcase into his Bentley, his movements efficient and practiced, as if he'd rehearsed this departure in his mind, long before executing it in reality. She'd known he was leaving, had tracked the apartment lease Gabrielle signed downtown, had seen the credit card charges for furniture and art that matched nothing in their shared home. Yet knowledge hadn't diminished the visceral shock of watching theory become practice, of watching the man she'd loved choose spectacle over substance with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from believing yourself beyond consequence. Victoria, you're not listening. Daniel's voice in the present pulled her back to Eleanor's foyer, yet his tone carried the same dismissive quality it had possessed that night. In the rain, the assumption that Victoria's attention was his by right, rather than something he needed to earn. If what you're saying is true, if you actually own Pinnacle Trust, then we can resolve this. The morality clause was poorly worded. Any lawyer would argue that detrimental to family obligations is too vague to enforce. We can renegotiate the terms, restructure the agreement, and pretend you didn't abandon your pregnant wife. Victoria's interruption carried steel she'd spent 7 years concealing beneath performed softness, steel that had been forged not in the rain 3 weeks ago, but across thousands of small humiliations she'd absorbed while building power Daniel couldn't imagine. Pretend your mother didn't strike me 30 minutes ago. Pretend this family hasn't treated me like charity they graciously extended to someone desperate for their approval. The flashback came unbidden, their wedding reception 7 years ago, when Eleanor had cornered Victoria in the powder room with champagne-fueled honesty that had felt like violence disguised as concern. You understand that Daniel could have married anyone, Eleanor had said, adjusting her pearls in the mirror, while Victoria stood frozen in her wedding dress. The Henderson girl was quite taken with him. Her family's pharmaceutical fortune would have been useful. But Daniel has always been sentimental, and I suppose your family's name carries weight even if the money attached to it evaporated. Just don't embarrass us by being unable to maintain appropriate appearances. Victoria had absorbed the warning like poison she'd been trained to swallow without complaint, had spent 7 years maintaining those appearances, while secretly rebuilding the Ashford fortune Eleanor assumed had permanently vanished. Her grandfather's $12 million had become $30 million within 2 years through careful market timing and strategic investments in technologies Daniel dismissed as fads that wouldn't last. Companies like a small electric vehicle manufacturer he'd mocked at a dinner party, while Victoria quietly purchased additional shares, or a social media platform he'd called a waste of time 6 months before its IPO made Victoria's initial investment worth 40 times what she'd paid. By year 5 of their marriage, Victoria's net worth had crossed 200 million, yet she'd maintained the fiction of financial dependence because her grandfather's warning still echoed. Wait until you're certain they value you beyond your money. Except Daniel had never valued her at all. Had valued the Ashford name, had valued the social connections her family provided, had valued the appearance of having a beautiful wife who asked nothing and demanded less. Yet he'd never valued Victoria herself, never bothered to learn about the woman he'd married beyond the surface details that served his narrative. The rain that night, Victoria spoke directly to Daniel, ignoring Gabrielle's hand that had returned to his arm as if physical contact could prevent the dissolution everyone in the room could feel approaching. Do you remember what you said to me? Your exact words before you drove away? Daniel's face went carefully blank, the expression he wore when negotiations turned unfavorable, when clients questioned his projections, when reality refused to conform to his preferred storyline. Yet Victoria saw recognition flicker in his eyes because some words, once spoken, become permanent. You said, "This is a relief, honestly. I've been pretending for months. Gabrielle makes me feel alive in ways you never could. You're just maintenance, Victoria, a responsibility I inherited when I married the Ashford name." Victoria's voice remained steady, despite the memory's emotional weight, despite the 7 months pregnant body that made standing for extended periods uncomfortable, despite the 30 witnesses whose expressions ranged from horror to vindication. You said I was maintenance, like a car that needed oil changes, like a house that needed repairs, like something you'd purchased that turned out to require more upkeep than anticipated. The words hung between them with the weight of prophecy fulfilled. Yet what Victoria needed Daniel to understand was that she'd heard worse, had heard Eleanor's assessment of her worth, had overheard Daniel's business partners joking about his trophy wife who doesn't know she's already been pawned, had absorbed 7 years of subtle and overt dismissals while building an empire specifically designed to demonstrate that maintenance could become mastery if given time and motivation. I was standing in the rain, Victoria continued, her hand moving to her belly where her daughter's kicks had become rhythmic, as if the baby was providing percussion to her. Mother's revelation. 7 months pregnant, watching you load suitcases with another woman's clothes, and I made a decision that night, not to destroy you, Daniel, but to stop protecting you from yourself. The distinction crystallized even as Victoria spoke it, because she'd spent 18 months funding his ventures anonymously, approving his loan application despite knowing he'd violate its terms, maintaining the fiction that his business acumen rather than her invisible support kept him afloat. She'd been enabling his worst qualities while pretending to be his victim, and the recognition settled on her shoulders with uncomfortable weight. Maybe justice required not just revealing Daniel's character, but forcing both of them to confront the dynamics they'd created together. The loan approval wasn't revenge, Victoria said, her voice quieter now, yet carrying to every corner of the foyer through sheer force of accumulated truth. It was documentation. I needed you to have every possible advantage. $50 million, clear contract terms, explicit requirements, so that when you failed, when you chose Gabrielle over our family, when you violated the morality clause, you couldn't claim ignorance or circumstance. You'd have failed with every resource available. That failure would be purely character. Gabrielle's hand dropped from Daniel's arm as if his skin had suddenly burned her, and Victoria watched the other woman's face cycle through calculations that probably mirrored her own 18 months ago, the recognition that the man beside her might not be the prize she'd imagined, that winning him might actually mean losing something more valuable than whatever she'd sacrificed to possess him. So what now? Daniel's question emerged defeated, yet Victoria heard beneath the defeat something more interesting. Genuine confusion, as if he'd never considered that his actions might have consequences beyond the ones he could negotiate or charm his way past. You own my last asset. You've humiliated me in front of my family. You've destroyed whatever future I thought I had. What else is there? Victoria looked at the man she'd married 7 years ago, at the billionaire who'd become a failure propped up by his abandoned wife's secret fortune, at the husband who'd chosen his mistress over his pregnant family, at the son whose mother had struck his wife while he stood paralyzed by social calculation, and she felt the rage she'd been carrying begin to transform into something more complex, something that felt less like hatred and more like grief for the marriage that might have existed if either of them had been brave enough to be honest. Now, Victoria said slowly, you have a choice. The choice Victoria offered hung in the air like a blade, suspended by thread, visible to everyone, understood by no one, capable of cutting in directions that wouldn't be clear until the moment it fell. Daniel's face registered confusion that might have been genuine. Yet Victoria had learned over 7 years that his confusion was often tactical, a performed vulnerability designed to elicit sympathy or buy time for calculation, and she refused to soften the terms of what came next simply because his comfort demanded it. You can fight the morality clause, Victoria said, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in 1,000 variations, testing each word for weakness before allowing it voice. Hire lawyers. Argue that abandoning your pregnant wife doesn't constitute behavior detrimental to family obligations, despite those being the exact words in the contract you signed. Spend the next 18 months in litigation that will cost you everything you don't have, while I deploy resources you can't match. Lose publicly, lose completely, lose in ways that ensure every business contact, every social connection, every person who ever believed in your competence watches you drown in consequences you created. The gathered witnesses shifted uncomfortably, some moving toward exits as if proximity to this confrontation might somehow implicate them, others leaning forward with the fascination humans feel when watching structures collapse with engineering precision. Yet Eleanor remained frozen in place, her hand that had struck Victoria now hanging at her side, like evidence she couldn't hide yet couldn't quite acknowledge. Or, Victoria continued, each word measured and deliberate. You can accept that the property portfolio now belongs to Pinnacle Trust. Accept that your financial foundation has transferred to the wife you abandoned. Accept that the empire you thought you built was actually constructed on invisible support I provided, while you credited yourself with genius. And then, this is the important part, Daniel, you can choose to become someone different. The flashback that interrupted Victoria's consciousness arrived with the force of physical impact. Their 5th anniversary dinner, when Daniel had casually mentioned that Victoria should consider going back to work because it might help with her self-esteem issues, never knowing that Victoria had just closed a deal that netted her $43 million in profit, while he'd been losing $12 million on a venture he'd refused to let her advise him on. She'd sat across the table, wearing the emerald necklace he'd given her that cost less than she'd made in interest that morning, and she'd smiled and nodded and absorbed his condescension because she'd still been hoping that time would reveal her value to him without requiring dramatic revelation. But time had simply magnified the distance between who they were and who they pretended to be, had amplified the lie of their marriage until it became the structure they lived inside, a beautiful facade maintained by Victoria's invisible labor and Daniel's willful blindness. What does that mean? Daniel's voice cracked on the last word, and Victoria heard beneath the question something she'd never heard from him before. Genuine fear, not of losing money, but of losing the narrative he'd constructed about himself. Become someone different? It means you stop pretending. Victoria's hand moved to the red mark on her cheek that had begun to fade, yet would remain in memory with permanent clarity. You stop pretending you built your success alone. You stop pretending Gabrielle represents passion rather than escape from responsibility. You stop pretending your mother's cruelty is strength. You stop pretending that wealth and character are the same thing. You stop pretending that the woman you married was ever as weak as you needed her to be. The words emerged with force that surprised Victoria, not because she hadn't known the truth, but because speaking it aloud after 7 years of silence felt like demolishing a structure she'd helped build, acknowledging her own complicity and maintaining the fiction that had ultimately consumed them both. She'd played weak to test if Daniel would value her anyway, yet playing weak had simply taught him to see her as weak, had trained them both into roles neither could escape without shattering everything they'd constructed together. "I don't understand what you want from me," Daniel said, and this time Victoria heard genuine confusion, the bewilderment of someone discovering that the script they'd been following wasn't actually the story being told. "You own everything. You've revealed that my success was your creation. You've shown everyone that I'm—" His voice failed, unable to complete the sentence that would require acknowledging what he'd become. "Broken," Victoria supplied softly, the word landing with precision between them. "You're broken, Daniel, but broken doesn't mean ended. It means you finally have the opportunity to rebuild yourself into something real instead of something performed." She pulled another document from her purse, not a contract this time, but a single page, handwritten, dated 3 weeks ago when she'd stood in the rain watching him drive away. The words had poured out that night in the empty penthouse, rage transmuting into something more dangerous than anger. Clarity. "I wrote this the night you left," Victoria said, holding the page up, yet not releasing it, not yet sharing the words she'd crystallized when grief was fresh enough to burn through self-deception. "It's not terms for returning my property. It's not conditions for reconciliation. It's a mirror, Daniel. Everything you've done, everything you've chosen, everything you've valued, reflected back with enough precision that you can't look away." Daniel's hand reached for the page, yet Victoria pulled it back, the movement instinctive, protective, because some revelations need preparation that hadn't yet occurred. "But before you read this," Victoria said, her voice dropping to conversational volume that somehow commanded more attention than shouting could achieve, "I need you to understand something about the choice I'm offering. It's not a choice between financial ruin and financial recovery. Money is already decided. The property is mine. The terms are enforceable. That ship has sailed. The choice is between remaining the person you've been, someone who performs success while drowning in failure, someone who blames others for consequences you created, someone who believes love is something you deserve rather than something you earn, or becoming someone capable of genuine transformation." She paused, letting the weight of the choice settle, watching Daniel's face cycle through emotions faster than he could process them. Denial, anger, calculation, fear, and finally something that might have been curiosity, except it looked too exhausted to sustain genuine interest. "If you choose transformation," Victoria continued, "it starts with accountability, real accountability, not the performed apology you'll craft to manipulate sympathy, but the uncomfortable work of understanding how you became someone capable of abandoning his pregnant wife in a rainstorm. It continues with action, attending therapy, making amends not through words, but through demonstrated change over years, becoming an actual father to our daughter, rather than another person she'll need therapy to process. And it ends, or maybe it never ends. Maybe that's the point, with you building a life based on genuine character, rather than performed status." The assembled witnesses had grown completely still, as if Victoria's words had frozen them mid-breath, and she realized that she wasn't just offering Daniel a choice, but demonstrating to everyone present what accountability looked like, when wielded with precision rather than performed with theatricality. Eleanor's voice finally broke the silence, thin and uncertain, in ways Victoria had never heard from her mother-in-law. "Victoria, She stopped, started again. "What I did was unacceptable. The slap, the words, all of it. I have no excuse except that I believed, I thought—" Another pause, longer this time. "I thought you were weak. I thought Daniel had married down. I thought our family was doing you a favor. And I was so catastrophically wrong that I don't know how to—" "You don't know how to apologize without qualifying it," Victoria interrupted gently, not cruelly. "Notice how you keep starting sentences that explain your cruelty rather than simply acknowledging it? That's the disease Daniel inherited from you, Eleanor, the inability to be wrong without immediately constructing a defense. And it's the disease that will destroy this family if someone doesn't break the pattern." The truth of it settled on Eleanor's face like physical weight, aging her 10 years in as many seconds, and Victoria felt a surge of something that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't entirely justice either. Recognition that Eleanor was as trapped by the roles this family demanded as Victoria had been, that cruelty often stems from playing parts that require dismissing our own humanity to maintain. "So here's my offer," Victoria said, addressing not just Daniel now but the entire room. Every witness who'd watched her get struck and called a beggar, every person who'd participated through action or silence in maintaining the fiction that power belonged only to those who performed it loudly. "Daniel, you can read this letter. You can engage with its contents honestly. You can choose to do the uncomfortable work of becoming someone different, or you can walk away, take Gabrielle, start over with nothing, blame me for your losses, and spend the rest of your life performing innocence to anyone who will listen. Both choices are available, but only one offers the possibility of knowing your daughter. Only one offers the chance to build something real, and only one requires you to be brave enough to be broken before you can be whole." She held out the letter, hand steady despite the trembling she felt throughout her body, despite her daughter's kicks that seemed to say, "Hurry, decide, move forward," despite 7 years of accumulated grief demanding acknowledgement. Daniel's hand rose slowly, reaching for the page, yet before his fingers made contact, Victoria spoke one final time. "When you read this, you'll understand that I'm not the person you married. Or maybe I am, but I'm no longer hiding who that person is. I'm not maintenance, Daniel. I'm not a responsibility. I'm not the Ashford name or the fiction we maintained or the woman who absorbed your dismissal without demanding better. I'm the person who rebuilt a fortune while you squandered yours. The person who owns the bank that could destroy or develop you. The person carrying your daughter who will know, someday, exactly what choice her father made in this moment." Daniel took the letter, his hands shaking slightly, the first visible crack in the composure he'd maintained throughout this entire confrontation, and Victoria watched him unfold it with the slow, careful movements of someone handling explosive material. The words Victoria had written that night in the rain were simple, absent of manipulation or strategy, just truth crystallized when grief was too fresh to obscure. "You broke my heart, but breaking hearts is easy. Anyone can destroy. The question is whether you're capable of the harder work. Building yourself into someone worthy of the second chance I shouldn't offer, but find myself unable to withhold. Our daughter deserves a father who chose transformation. I deserve a co-parent who did the work, and you deserve the opportunity to become real. Take it or don't. But know that this is your only chance to be someone our daughter admires, rather than someone she has to forgive." Daniel read it once, twice, his face transforming as comprehension replaced calculation, as the weight of genuine choice settled onto shoulders that had never carried anything heavier than performance. "I don't know if I can," he whispered finally, the words barely audible. "I don't know how to be what you're describing. I don't know if I'm capable of. "That's the first honest thing you've said all night," Victoria replied. "Start there." The spring sunshine filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria's corner office at Pinnacle Trust, illuminating the photographs arranged carefully on her mahogany desk. Images that told a story of transformation more eloquent than any corporate report could capture. The largest frame held her daughter Emma, now 11 months old. Her dark eyes reflecting the same determination Victoria saw in her own mirror each morning, yet softened by an innocence Victoria was determined to protect while teaching strength. Beside Emma's photo sat a smaller frame containing an image that still surprised visitors who knew the backstory: Victoria and Daniel, standing on opposite sides of Emma's crib, neither touching yet both present, their faces carrying the exhausted relief of parents who'd survived their daughter's first fever together. The photograph didn't represent reconciliation. Victoria had been clear about that boundary from the beginning, yet it documented something more valuable than romantic reunion. Two people learning to co-parent with honesty that their marriage had never possessed. Daniel's transformation hadn't been the dramatic conversion Victoria's anger had initially demanded, yet it had been real in ways that mattered more than performance. The therapy sessions he'd committed to, first weekly, now monthly, had stripped away the performed confidence that had masked his genuine insecurities, revealing a man who'd spent his entire life terrified of being ordinary yet never willing to do the extraordinary work that genuine excellence required. He'd sold his remaining personal possessions to fund a modest apartment, taken a middle management position at a company that valued steady competence over flashy innovation, and showed up every Tuesday and Thursday evening to read to Emma with the kind of patient attention he'd never demonstrated during their marriage. The property portfolio that had transferred to Pinnacle Trust when Daniel violated the morality clause remained Victoria's, yet she'd done something with it that had surprised even herself. Converted 3 of the commercial buildings into affordable housing developments, partnering with nonprofit organizations to ensure that families who'd been abandoned by systems designed to protect them had access to safe, dignified homes. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. The assets she'd claimed through Daniel's abandonment now served others who'd experienced similar betrayal, transforming his failure into someone else's foundation. Eleanor's transformation had been slower, more resistant, yet somehow more complete. The matriarch of the Ashford family had attended exactly 1 therapy session before declaring it self-indulgent nonsense. Yet she'd shown up at Victoria's apartment 2 weeks later with a handwritten letter 17 pages long, single-spaced, no qualifications, just accountability so raw it had made Victoria cry reading it. The relationship between them would never be warm, yet it had become honest, built on Eleanor's acknowledgement that cruelty disguised as standards had poisoned her relationship with her son and nearly destroyed her chance to know her granddaughter. The Ashford family reunions continued, yet their character had fundamentally shifted. The performance of status had given way to something messier, but more genuine. Conversations about actual struggles rather than curated successes, acknowledgement of failures rather than elaborate cover stories, the uncomfortable work of being real with each other instead of maintaining facades that required constant energy to sustain. Some family members had drifted away, unable to function without the old hierarchies that had given them identity, yet others had emerged from the wreckage more substantial than the roles they'd been playing. Gabrielle had disappeared from Daniel's life 3 months after the reunion, her interest evaporating once she understood that the billionaire she'd pursued was actually a failed entrepreneur living on his ex-wife's mercy. Victoria had felt no triumph in that dissolution, only a weary recognition that Gabrielle had been chasing the same illusion Daniel had been selling, the fantasy that wealth and character were synonymous, that performing success was equivalent to earning it. Victoria's secret trillionaire status was no longer secret. The business press had discovered her identity within weeks of the reunion, leading to profiles in Forbes and Fortune that attempted to capture how a woman had built an $800 million empire while playing housewife to a man who never noticed. The attention had been uncomfortable, yet useful, opening doors to other women who'd been hiding their capabilities, building networks of support for people who'd learned to survive by making themselves small. The rain still came to the city regularly, yet Victoria had made peace with storms. She'd installed a reading nook by her apartment's largest window, a place where she'd sit with Emma during thunderstorms, reading stories about brave women who'd faced impossible odds and emerged transformed. She wanted her daughter to understand that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about choosing how to rebuild yourself when breaking became inevitable. Daniel had asked twice if reconciliation might be possible, if the work he was doing, the person he was becoming, might earn him a second chance at the marriage he'd destroyed. Victoria's answer had been gentle, but absolute. Some things, once broken, transform into something new rather than returning to what they were. They would be co-parents who respected each other, former spouses who'd learned from their failures, two people who'd loved each other badly yet were learning to care for each other well. But they would not be married again, would not pretend that transformation erased history, or that change negated consequence. The choice Victoria had offered Daniel that night in Eleanor's foyer, transformation or destruction, had revealed something she hadn't fully understood when extending it. The choice had been as much for her as for him. She'd needed to decide whether she wanted to be the kind of person who wielded power through punishment or through possibility, whether her strength would manifest as vengeance or as something more complicated and more difficult, the willingness to hold people accountable while remaining open to their capacity for change. On her desk, beside the photographs and beneath the window's streaming light, sat the folder from that night. The loan documents, the morality clause, the evidence of everything that had shattered and everything that had been rebuilt from the pieces. Victoria kept it not as trophy but as reminder. Power without wisdom is just another form of violence, and wisdom without power is just another form of silence. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, announcing her 2 o'clock appointment, a woman whose husband had abandoned her pregnant with twins, whose mother-in-law had called her worthless, who'd discovered she possessed skills and assets she'd been trained to hide. Victoria had been meeting with women like her for months now, not offering money but offering something more valuable, the roadmap she'd created, the mistakes she'd learned from, the recognition that their stories didn't have to end with abandonment but could transform into something they'd never imagined possible. "Send her in," Victoria said, her hand moving instinctively to Emma's photograph, drawing strength from her daughter's image, the way she once would have drawn strength from rage. The woman who entered, Amanda, recently divorced, recently dismissed, recently awakened to possibilities that terrified and thrilled her, looked exactly like Victoria had looked 7 years ago, uncertain yet determined, broken yet beginning to understand that breaking could be the first step toward becoming whole. "Tell me your story," Victoria said, the words she'd spoken to dozens of women who'd sat in this same chair, women who'd been called beggars by people who'd never understood that worth and wealth were different currencies entirely. And as Amanda began to speak, haltingly at first, then with increasing confidence, Victoria felt the purpose that had been forged in rain and reunion settle more firmly into her bones. This was what she'd been building toward, what all the secrecy and strategy and silent strength had been preparing her for. Not revenge against one man, but revolution for countless women who'd been taught that power belonged to others, that their capabilities were hobbies rather than foundations, that maintenance was the highest role they could aspire to. Through her office window, Victoria could see the city spreading below. Buildings she owned, businesses she'd invested in, Lives she'd touched through decisions made in boardrooms people assumed she'd never enter. The empire she'd built in shadows had finally emerged into light. Yet the transition hadn't diminished its substance. If anything, the visibility had amplified its impact. Emma would grow up in a world where her mother's power wasn't secret, where strength didn't require performance, where being real mattered more than appearing perfect. She'd know her father not as the man who'd abandoned them, but as the man who'd chosen transformation when destruction would have been easier. She'd know her grandmother not as the woman who'd struck her mother, but as the woman who'd done the uncomfortable work of acknowledging her cruelty and changing her character. And she'd know from her mother's example and her mother's teaching that the greatest power isn't the ability to destroy your enemies, but the wisdom to offer them the choice to become something better and the strength to let them face the consequences when they refuse. The rain began again as Amanda finished her story, drops pattering against the window like applause for courage that didn't know it was being brave. Victoria smiled, recognizing the sound that had once marked her, breaking now marking someone else's beginning, and she understood with crystalline clarity that this, helping others transform their pain into power, was what every moment of her journey had been preparing her for. "Here's what we're going to do," Victoria said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd walked this path and emerged transformed. "We're going to build you an empire they'll never see coming." And in the photograph on her desk, Emma seemed to smile, as if she already understood that her mother's greatest legacy wouldn't be the wealth she'd accumulated, but the women she'd taught to stop hiding their strength, to stop apologizing for their power, to stop waiting for permission to become everything they'd always been capable of being. The choice Victoria had offered Daniel that night had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have predicted, transforming not just one family but creating a framework for transformation that extended far beyond her personal revenge. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't about making people pay, it was about making them choose, and then ensuring they understood the full weight of their choices. And in that understanding, Victoria had found something more valuable than revenge, more lasting than destruction. The purpose that comes from transforming your own, breaking into someone else's breakthrough, your own pain into someone else's power, your own story into proof that being called a beggar by people who don't understand your worth is just the beginning of becoming someone they'll never be capable of dismissing again.